going to go ahead and create a new profile, and we're just going to call it a personal cultivation setup. And this is going to be for a self-watering planter or personal cultivation feeder system along with relays with lighting. So let's just go ahead and start with the bare profile. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a motor switch. Actually, we'll set up a water pump on our first channel, and we're going to set it to trigger. We're not going to put it in a group. We're going to stick it by itself, and we're going to trigger it for a 60-second water cycle when it runs, and then just click deploy. Now this trigger is ready to go. It's ready to be set up by trigger. So, but we need something to actually trigger it. So what we're going to do is we're going to use our analog sensor, and we're going to use a soil moisture sensor here. We're not going to send an alert when it triggers. We can do that later, but we are going to set up it to trigger the pin we just set up, the DC water pump we just set up. Except we're going to trigger on a moisture level of 7, maybe to 8, and then we're going to try to trigger 3 times to hit that target. Now we'll have to calibrate the moisture sensor later, and we'll show you other videos of how you can do that. But putting a real high moisture level, trigger moisture level, and then a target moisture level right above it, this will keep the soil really moist and ensure that your plant gets watered 2 or 3 times a day. If you want to get more convenient or more granular watering, you can kind of tighten your calibration, and we'll launch more videos about that later. But all you do is you just click deploy, and now you're ready to go. Once your moisture level drops to a certain threshold, it's going to trigger this pump into watering. So that's the initial basic setup. Now what we want to do is we want to protect this pump, and the way we're going to do that is we're going to use a water level sensor switch. And the water level sensor switch, we're going to just go ahead and protect it, set it to protect that pump. So now if this switch is triggered, this pump will not run. It won't be allowed to run. We can also trigger something else into action if we wanted to start refilling a reservoir or some other action. But we're not going to do anything in that case. So we're just going to set the water level sensor switch up to protect. Now what we could also do is send us an alert, which is helpful. So device name out of water. There we go. So now we've got our level sensor switch, our water level sensor switch set up at the bottom of the pump to set it up to protect it. We might want to add in this other pull-up channel, we have an option. So we could either do a water level sensor switch or a temperature sensor. If I were going to add a water level sensor switch here, you're only going to plug it into these left 2 pins, as I showed you in the previous video. But the only thing I want to do here is I don't want to protect and I don't want to trigger anything. All I would want to do is set an alert and saying device name water is low. So if the water's getting low but not out, so that's where you could use 2 water level sensor switches. Alternatively here, you can plug in a submersible temperature sensor. And with that, you could trigger on a high temp or low temp trigger and basically turn on a device. So if I wanted to turn on a fan or some other I/O that I had already assigned, I could do that. Or you could just leave your trigger action disabled and just monitor the temperature if you wanted to do that. So you can trigger actions and things like that with the temperature sensor. Right now, we're just not going to have this one assigned. But if we actually, yeah, we'll go and assign a temperature sensor just for giggles. Okay, so if we wanted to set up, we'll come back to this. So let's just have a trigger action disabled right now, but we'll set up a temp sensor. Okay, so let's get to the lighting. Okay, let's say we wanted to have lighting. We would set it to a general digital output. The thing with these relays is they trigger and turn on a low. So what we could do is we could you could run a daily schedule low. We're working on the daily schedule and daily frequency algorithms. What I would recommend doing is go ahead and just setting it always low. And what that's going to do is that's going to turn it on. It's always going to be on. Your lighting for this profile will always be on. So, okay, so how would you want to turn it off? What you would do is you would go ahead and you would set up a profile that doesn't do anything during the day, so that way it wouldn't water at all when the lighting's off. And then you could set up a dynamically scheduled profile, a second profile, this profile to actually come on later, and I'll show you how to do that. So let's just go ahead and set this one, this light to be always on, and let's say this one is a fan, and we're just going to have it a digital output, and we're going to trigger it low. And when it's low, we're going to turn it on for 2 minutes. And simple as that. So that we just set up a fan on a relay, and this is our light. This light's always on. This fan is active when it's triggered. And what we're going to do to trigger that is the temperature. Where the temperature reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 76 or whatever you want. So when the temperature is above 76 degrees Fahrenheit, we are going to trigger this digital output that triggers low, pin 14. Here's our light that's always low. This one's going to trigger low, and so let's make sure we get the right one, pin 14, deploy. So now we've added a fan trigger to our assembly, which is kind of cool. If we wanted to run 2 lights, what we could do is we could turn this trigger off, come back, and put this one as always low. And now we've got 2 independent light settings. The relays can switch 15 amps apiece, so you could run two overhead grow lights if you wanted to in that case. So that's how you set up your relays on your back end. And what you could do is, if they were triggered, you could put them all in the same group. But I'll show you how to do that. So let's say over here on this pump, we wanted to run an LED switch. We could run an LED switch here that triggers on, let's say, motion detect if we weren't running a relay here. But one of the most practical use cases is running a either air pump or water pump. In parallel. And so whatever you put here, you can also set it to be by trigger and to run for the same amount or a different amount of time and deploy. Now what's interesting though is if right now we've got this pump set to trigger on soil moisture. So if we add each one to a group, what we can do then is we can go down to the analog soil moisture sensor and trigger a group instead. So now instead of triggering that one pump, we're going to trigger both pumps with the soil moisture sensor. So there's a lot of interesting things you guys can do with this profile. Now let me show you, this is our, what do we call this? We call this personal cultivation setup. And then let's just go ahead and deploy it. Okay, so this one's ready to go. And then if we were going to create a new profile, we could do is call it personal cultivation setup idle. And so what we'd want to do with this one is maybe we don't want to water at all. We don't want it watering, so we just don't do anything. We still want it reporting analog soil moisture data, so we can set up the soil moisture sensor, just not set any trigger action, and just click deploy. And so then it'll report the analog data there for the soil moisture. The digital IOs, what we want to do here is we want to set those as digital outputs, and we want to run them as always high. Deploy. And the reason we do this is this keeps the relays off. So during this mode, it keeps the relays off. And if we also wanted to add, I think we had a temperature sensor here, so we want to do that. We want to keep monitoring our temperature. You know, we may actually want to keep our high temp trigger here. So add the same triggering mechanisms that you had before. I think that was pin output. So let's do that, but what we've got to do is come back up here to pin 14, and we're going to set it to a trigger low. That'll force it off unless it's triggered. We're going to trigger it for 2 minutes, and that's that. So we'll still have the temperature sensor triggering the fan if we wanted it to, but what we won't have is we don't have the lights on during this profile. It's the exact opposite of what we want for the lighting. And we're not going to do any watering when the light's off. Let's say we don't want that to happen. So that's pretty much all we'd need to do for this profile. And then what we would do is we'd head to our dashboard and find our device. And so we'd set our main profile to our personal cultivation setup idle, right? The one that doesn't do anything. That's going to be our normal profile. And then you would save your details, come down here, and you would set up to schedule your personal cultivation setup active, your one with lighting, and set your start time for whatever time you want it to be active from. So if you wanted to run from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., right, you could do that. If you wanted to run from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m., you could do that. But you just set your scheduling up and then click Schedule Profile. And then once it's scheduled, you'll see it. So you'll see your normal profile and then your regular profile. And if you go to your dashboard and you look for your device right here. So this is kind of your data. It doesn't have any data yet, and it's waiting to download the new profile. So that's pretty much how you do it. So it's going to run a personal cultivation setup because it's during our time. It's during our active time when we set this up. That's how you schedule dynamic profiles. And okay, guys, thanks for watching. I appreciate it. Please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'm going to show you this thing in action real quick.
What time is it? Ha!